The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Marcus Thompson adjusted his crisp uniform for what he believed would be another ordinary day of duty. At 42, Marcus had served the royal family for nearly 2 decades, working his way up from a junior security officer to one of the most trusted personal guards assigned to the young princes. His weathered face bore the quiet dignity of a man who had dedicated his life to service, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing as they swept the grounds with practiced precision. Marcus had grown up in a small village outside London, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher. Money had always been tight in the Thompson household, but his parents had instilled in him values that no amount of wealth could buy: integrity, loyalty, and an unwavering sense of duty. When he first applied to join the Royal Protection Unit at 23, fresh out of military service, he never imagined that his life would become so deeply intertwined with the lives of Britain's most famous family. The years had flown by in a blur of state functions, public appearances, and quiet family moments that the public never saw. Marcus had been there when Prince William took his first steps as a married man, had stood guard during countless bedtime stories, and had watched Prince George grow from a curious toddler into the thoughtful young boy he was today. The 8-year-old prince had always been different from what people expected. Where the media painted pictures of a typical royal child living in luxury and privilege, Marcus saw something else entirely. Prince George was remarkably observant for his age. He noticed things that adults often missed, asked questions that revealed wisdom beyond his years, and showed a genuine concern for the people around him that surprised even the most seasoned palace staff. Marcus had witnessed countless small moments that never made it into newspapers or royal biographies, moments where the young prince had shown kindness to servants, curiosity about the lives of ordinary people, and an unusual awareness of the responsibilities that would one day rest on his shoulders. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Marcus was assigned to accompany Prince George to a private tutoring session in one of the castle's smaller libraries. The boy had been unusually quiet during breakfast, picking at his food while gazing thoughtfully out the window. His governess, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, had mentioned to Marcus that the prince seemed to have something weighing on his mind, though she couldn't determine what it might be. As they walked through the ornate corridors lined with centuries-old portraits of monarchs past, Prince George suddenly stopped in front of a particular painting. It depicted King George VI, his great-great-grandfather, in military uniform during World War II. The young prince stared at the painting with an intensity that made Marcus pause as well. "Mr. Thompson," Prince George said quietly, his voice carrying a maturity that always caught people off guard. "Do you think being brave means you're never scared, or does it mean doing the right thing even when you are scared?" Marcus was momentarily taken aback by the depth of the question. In his years of service, he had fielded countless questions from the young prince, but this one felt different. There was a weight to it that suggested something more than childish curiosity. "I believe true bravery comes from doing what's right even when you're frightened." "Your Royal Highness," Marcus replied carefully, crouching down to meet the boy at eye level. "Some of the bravest people I've ever known were terrified, but they chose to act anyway, because they knew it was the right thing to do." The prince nodded slowly, his blue eyes reflecting a seriousness that seemed almost out of place on such a young face. "My great-great-grandfather was scared during the war, wasn't he? But he still did what he thought was best for everyone." "Yes, he was," Marcus confirmed, remembering the historical accounts he had read about the wartime king's struggles with his speech impediment and the enormous pressure he faced during Britain's darkest hour. He was very frightened, but he found the courage to lead when his people needed him most. They continued toward the library in contemplative silence, but Marcus found himself wondering what had prompted such philosophical questions from the 8-year-old. As they reached the heavy wooden door of the library, Prince George turned to him once more. "Mr. Thompson, may I ask you something personal?" Marcus nodded, though he felt a flutter of uncertainty. The prince had never requested to discuss anything personal before. "Why did you become a guard? I mean, really why? Not the official reason everyone always gives." The question hit Marcus unexpectedly. He had given the standard answer countless times to reporters, colleagues, and even family members: duty to country, honor of serving the crown, stable career. But standing there in that hallway, looking into the earnest eyes of this remarkable child, Marcus found himself compelled to give a more honest answer. "I wanted to protect people who couldn't protect themselves," he said slowly. "When I was your age, my younger sister was bullied at school. She was different, you see. She had learning difficulties, and some of the other children were cruel to her. I couldn't always be there to help her, and it made me feel helpless. I suppose I became a guard because I never wanted to feel that helpless again." Prince George listened with the kind of focused attention that most adults struggled to maintain. When Marcus finished speaking, the boy was quiet for a long moment. "Do you think," the prince said finally, "that sometimes the people who seem the strongest on the outside are actually the ones who need the most protection?" The question lingered in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus felt something shift in that moment, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. There was something about the way Prince George had asked it, something about the timing and the context, that made him feel as though the boy was trying to tell him something important. Before Marcus could formulate a response, Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway of the library, her kind face creased with concern. "Your Royal Highness, we should begin your mathematics lesson," she said gently. "Your parents will be expecting a progress report this evening." As Prince George disappeared into the library with his governess, Marcus remained in the hallway for several minutes, replaying their conversation in his mind. In 20 years of royal service, he had become accustomed to the formal distance that protocol required between himself and the family he protected. But this morning had felt different. For the first time, he felt as though Prince George had spoken to him not as a royal addressing a servant, but as one human being reaching out to another. The rest of the day passed in routine activities, but Marcus found his attention repeatedly drifting back to their conversation. During the prince's afternoon piano lesson, Marcus noticed how the boy's fingers moved across the keys with surprising gentleness, coaxing melodies that seemed to reflect the same thoughtfulness he had displayed in the hallway. During tea time, he observed how Prince George interacted with the kitchen staff, thanking each person individually and asking about their families with genuine interest. These weren't new behaviors, Marcus realized. The prince had always been considerate and kind. But today, Marcus was seeing these qualities through a different lens. He was beginning to understand that what he had always attributed to good upbringing and natural politeness might actually be something deeper, an innate understanding of other people's feelings and needs that was remarkable in someone so young. That evening, as Marcus completed his final security check before going off duty, he encountered Prince George once more in the castle's main hallway. The boy was in his pajamas, apparently on his way to bid his parents good night before bed. When he saw Marcus, he approached with the same serious expression he had worn that morning. "Mr. Thompson," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone, "I've been thinking about what you said today, about feeling helpless when you couldn't protect your sister." Marcus nodded, wondering where this conversation might lead. "I think," Prince George continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "that there are times when the people who are supposed to protect us might need someone to protect them instead, even if that someone is just a little boy who's supposed to be in bed." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that Marcus was only beginning to grasp. Before he could respond, the prince had already turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing alone in the dimly lit hallway with the growing realization that something significant was about to change. The following morning brought an unusual change to the daily routine at Windsor Castle. Marcus arrived for his shift to find Prince George waiting for him in the entrance hall, fully dressed despite the early hour. The boy's face carried the same serious expression from the previous day, but there was something new in his demeanor, a quiet determination that made Marcus instinctively straighten his shoulders. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," the prince said formally, then added in a lower voice, "I was hoping we might take a walk before my lessons begin. There's something I need to show you." This was highly irregular. The prince's schedule was meticulously planned weeks in advance, and spontaneous walks were not part of the approved routine. Marcus felt torn between his duty to follow protocol and his growing sense that whatever Prince George wanted to share with him was genuinely important. "Perhaps we should check with your parents first, Your Royal Highness," Marcus suggested carefully. "They're still in their morning meeting with the Prime Minister's office," Prince George replied, "and this won't take long. Please, Mr. Thompson, it's important." Something in the boy's tone convinced Marcus to make an exception. They walked together through the castle grounds, following a path that led toward the more secluded areas of the estate. Prince George moved with purpose, clearly heading toward a specific destination. As they walked, Marcus noticed that the boy seemed more animated than usual, as if he had been holding something inside and was finally ready to let it out. They arrived at a small rose garden that was rarely visited by tourists or even family members. It was a peaceful spot, surrounded by high hedges that provided privacy from the main grounds. Prince George led Marcus to a bench beneath an old oak tree and gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Thompson," the prince began, his voice steady but soft, "yesterday, you told me about your sister and about wanting to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. I've been thinking about that all night." Marcus waited patiently, sensing that interrupting would break whatever spell was allowing this extraordinary conversation to take place. "There's something happening that I don't think any of the adults know about," Prince George continued. "Or maybe they do know, but they're pretending they don't, because it's easier that way." The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a small notebook. Marcus recognized it as the kind of journal the prince used for his writing exercises, but this one looked different, older and more worn, as if it had been used frequently. "I started writing things down a few months ago," Prince George explained, opening the notebook to reveal pages covered in careful handwriting. "Not the stories Mrs. Hartwell assigns for lessons, but real things. Things I see and hear that make me worry." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The idea that an 8-year-old child was documenting concerning observations about his own life was deeply troubling. Prince George flipped through several pages before stopping at a particular entry. "May I read you something?" Marcus nodded, though every instinct told him that whatever he was about to hear would change everything. "Tuesday, September 15th, the prince read aloud. "Today I heard Mr. Pemberton talking on his phone in the corridor outside Father's study. He was very upset and kept saying things like, 'This can't continue,' and 'someone's going to get hurt.' When he saw me listening, he stopped talking immediately and pretended to be discussing scheduling, but his hands were shaking, and he looked frightened." Marcus recognized the name. James Pemberton was one of the senior protection officers, a man with an impeccable record who had been with the family for over 15 years. The idea that he might be involved in something concerning enough to frighten an experienced professional was deeply unsettling. Prince George turned to another page. "September 22nd. During the state dinner, I noticed that 3 of the new guards kept watching each other instead of watching for threats. They had a way of looking at each other that reminded me of the boys at school when they're planning to do something they know they shouldn't. When Mr. Harrison, the head of security, walked past, they all looked away very quickly." The prince continued reading several more entries, each one detailing observations that painted a picture of growing tension and suspicious behavior among the very people responsible for the family's safety. Marcus felt his professional training kicking in as he processed the information. If even half of what Prince George had observed was accurate, there was a serious security breach developing within the palace walls. "Your Royal Highness," Marcus said carefully, "these are very serious observations. Have you shared any of this with your parents or with the head of security?" Prince George closed the notebook and looked up at Marcus with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. "That's just it, Mr. Thompson. I tried to tell Father last week, but he was very busy with parliamentary affairs and he patted my head and said I had quite an imagination. Mother listened a bit longer, but I could tell she thought I was just being a typical child who watches too many spy films." Marcus felt his heart sink. He could imagine how the conversation must have gone. To adult ears, a child's concerns about suspicious behavior among trained security professionals would sound like the product of an overactive imagination, especially when that child lived in a world where intrigue and danger were common themes in books and movies. "But there's more," Prince George continued. "Things I haven't written down because I was afraid someone might find my notebook." The boy stood up and walked to the edge of the garden, his small frame silhouetted against the morning sky. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. 3 nights ago, I couldn't sleep because of a thunderstorm. I went to the library to read, and I saw Mr. Pemberton meeting with someone I didn't recognize. They were in the small conference room that's supposed to be locked after hours. They were looking at papers and photographs, and when they saw me, they both looked terrified. Mr. Pemberton said I was sleepwalking and that I should go back to bed immediately. Marcus felt a cold realization washing over him. If Prince George's observations were accurate, there was a conspiracy developing within the palace security structure. The implications were staggering. "The man Mr. Pemberton was meeting with," Marcus asked. "Can you describe him?" Prince George thought for a moment. "He was tall, with gray hair and a scar on his left hand. He wore an expensive suit, not a uniform like the guards, and he had an accent, not British, maybe European, but I'm not sure which country." Marcus's blood ran cold. The description matched that of Viktor Kozlov, a former intelligence operative who had been flagged by security services as a person of interest in several international incidents. If Kozlov was somehow involved with palace security personnel, the situation was even more dangerous than he had imagined. "Your Royal Highness," Marcus said, choosing his words very carefully, "what you're telling me is extremely important. But I need to understand, why are you sharing this with me? Why not insist that your parents listen or contact someone higher up in the security chain?" Prince George turned back to face him, and Marcus was struck once again by the unusual maturity in the boy's expression. "Because," the prince said simply, "you're the only person who has ever asked me about being brave when you're scared. And because yesterday, when I asked about protecting people who are supposed to be strong, you understood what I meant even if you didn't say so." The weight of the moment settled between them like a physical presence. Marcus realized that this 8-year-old boy had been carrying the burden of these observations alone for months, had tried to share his concerns with the people who should have listened most carefully, and had been dismissed as an imaginative child. Now, in desperation, he was turning to the one adult who had shown him genuine respect and understanding. "There's something else," Prince George said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Something that happened yesterday evening after we talked in the hallway." Marcus leaned forward, every sense on high alert. "I was in my room, supposedly asleep, when I heard voices in the corridor outside my door. One of them was Mr. Pemberton, and he was arguing with someone about moving the timeline forward. The other person said that the boy was becoming too observant, and that they needed to act soon, before he said something to the wrong person. The notebook slipped from Marcus's hands as the full implications of what he was hearing crashed over him. Prince George wasn't just observing suspicious behavior among the security staff, he had become a target of that suspicion himself. His natural intelligence and observational skills had made him a threat to whatever plan was developing. "They were talking about you," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. Prince George nodded solemnly. "I think so, yes. And Mr. Thompson, I think they know that I know." The morning sun continued to rise over Windsor Castle, but for Marcus Thompson, the world had suddenly become a much darker place. Everything he had believed about his role, his purpose, and his duty was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. The silence in the rose garden stretched between them as Marcus processed the full magnitude of what Prince George had shared with him. Every fiber of his training screamed at him to follow protocol, to report this information through official channels, to trust in the systems that had protected the royal family for generations. But those same systems appeared to be compromised, and the 8-year-old boy sitting beside him had become an unwitting target in what could only be described as a conspiracy. Marcus looked at Prince George, seeing him now not just as the future king he was sworn to protect, but as a frightened child who had been forced to carry an impossible burden alone. The boy's courage in seeking him out, in trusting him with information that could put them both in danger, was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "Your Royal Highness," Marcus said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind, "I need you to understand something very important. What you've shared with me changes everything. I believe you completely. But acting on this information means I may have to break rules that I've followed my entire career." Prince George met his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Thompson, when you told me about your sister, you said you never wanted to feel helpless again. Right now, I feel very helpless. And I think you might be the only person who can help me not feel that way anymore." The simple honesty of the statement struck Marcus like a physical blow. Here was a child who should have been worried about schoolwork and playground friendships, instead carrying the weight of knowledge that could threaten his own safety and the security of his family. The parallel to his sister's situation all those years ago was painfully clear. Marcus made his decision. "I'm going to help you," he said quietly. "But we need to be very careful about how we proceed. If your observations are correct, and I believe they are, then we're dealing with people who have access to the highest levels of security information. We can't trust anyone until we know who's involved and who isn't." Prince George nodded, relief flooding his features for the first time since their conversation had begun. "What do we do?" Marcus thought quickly, his mind racing through possibilities and dangers. "First, we need to document everything you've observed in a way that can't be dismissed or ignored. Then we need to find someone outside the current security structure who can act on that information. But most importantly, we need to keep you safe while we do it." They spent the next hour developing a plan that would have been remarkable for its sophistication, even if it had come from trained professionals, let alone from a collaboration between a security guard and an 8-year-old boy. Prince George would continue his normal routine, but would pay attention to specific details that Marcus outlined for him. Meanwhile, Marcus would begin his own discreet investigation, using his knowledge of palace procedures to identify potential weaknesses and collaborators. The first test of their partnership came sooner than either had expected. That afternoon, as Prince George was completing his language lessons with Mrs. Hartwell, Marcus noticed James Pemberton approaching him with an expression that immediately raised his professional instincts. "Thompson," Pemberton said casually, "I understand you had an unusual conversation with Prince George this morning. Something about taking an unscheduled walk?" Marcus kept his expression neutral, though internally his alarm bells were ringing. The fact that Pemberton knew about their walk and more importantly that he was asking about it, confirmed Prince George's suspicions about surveillance and compromised security. "The prince requested some fresh air before his lessons," Marcus replied evenly. "Standard protective procedures were maintained throughout." Pemberton studied him for a moment, and Marcus could see calculation behind his eyes. "Of course. It's just that we've noticed the boy has been particularly observant lately, asking questions, showing interest in security procedures. His parents are concerned that he might be developing anxiety about his safety." This was clearly a probe, an attempt to determine how much Marcus knew and whether he might be receptive to whatever plan was in motion. Marcus realized that his response in this moment could determine not only his own fate, but Prince George's as well. "Children his age are naturally curious," Marcus said carefully. "I've found that honest, age-appropriate answers tend to satisfy that curiosity better than evasion." "Honest answers," Pemberton repeated, his tone suggesting that he found something significant in Marcus's word choice. "Yes, I suppose honesty is important, especially when it comes to understanding one's role and responsibilities." The veiled threat in Pemberton's words was unmistakable. Marcus realized that he was being recruited, that Pemberton believed he might be willing to join whatever conspiracy was developing. The thought made his stomach turn, but it also presented an opportunity. "I've always believed in fulfilling my responsibilities," Marcus replied, letting just enough ambiguity into his voice to suggest that he might be open to persuasion. Pemberton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Excellent. Perhaps we should have a more detailed conversation soon. There are some changes coming to the security protocols, and men of your experience and flexibility will be valuable during the transition." After Pemberton walked away, Marcus felt as though he had just navigated a minefield, but he had also gained crucial information. Whatever was being planned, it involved changes to security protocols and a transition that would require the cooperation of existing guards. This suggested something far more complex than a simple security breach. That evening, Marcus found an opportunity to share this information with Prince George during what appeared to be a routine security check of the prince's quarters. The boy listened with the same intense focus he had shown in the garden, processing implications with a sophistication that continued to amaze Marcus. "They think you might join them," Prince George observed quietly. "That could be helpful, couldn't it? If they trust you, you might learn more about what they're planning." Marcus marveled at the boy's tactical thinking, but the idea of pretending to collaborate with people who posed a threat to the prince made him deeply uncomfortable. "It's possible," he admitted, "but it would also be dangerous. If they suspect I'm not genuine in my cooperation, both of us could be in serious trouble." Prince George was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Marcus with an expression of startling determination. "Mr. Thompson, I've been thinking about what you said about bravery. About doing the right thing even when you're scared. I'm very scared right now, but I know what the right thing is." Marcus waited for him to continue, though he had a growing sense of where this was leading. "I think we should tell them that I've started to trust you more than the other guards. That I've been asking you questions because I feel safer with you than with anyone else. That way, if they want to use you to get closer to me, it will seem natural." The suggestion was brilliant in its simplicity, but it also meant deliberately putting Prince George in greater danger by making him appear more vulnerable to manipulation. "That's very clever thinking," Marcus said slowly, "but it would mean taking enormous risks." "Everything is risky now," Prince George replied with wisdom far beyond his years. "At least this way, we choose which risks to take, instead of just waiting for someone else to make the choice for us." Over the following days, they implemented their strategy with careful precision. Prince George began showing a marked preference for Marcus's company, requesting his presence during lessons and activities where other guards would normally be assigned. To outside observers, It appeared that the young prince was developing a case of hero worship for the guard, who treated him with unusual respect and attention. Marcus, meanwhile, allowed himself to appear receptive to Pemberton's increasingly frequent approaches. He expressed subtle dissatisfaction with certain aspects of royal protocol, hinted at financial concerns that might make him open to alternative arrangements, and generally presented himself as a man who could be swayed with the right combination of pressure and incentive. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after Prince George had first shared his notebook in the Rose Garden. Pemberton approached Marcus with an invitation to join him for drinks at a private club in London, ostensibly to discuss career opportunities within the security field. Marcus knew that accepting the invitation would cross a line from which there might be no return, but he also knew that it was the only way to learn enough about the conspiracy to stop it before Prince George came to harm. "I appreciate the invitation," Marcus told Pemberton. "I've been hoping for an opportunity to discuss my future prospects." That night, as Marcus prepared for what might be the most dangerous conversation of his career, he received an unexpected message. It was delivered by Mrs. Hartwell, who explained that Prince George had asked her to give it to him before he left the castle. The message was written in the prince's careful handwriting on a piece of castle stationery. "Dear Mr. Thompson, whatever happens tonight, please remember that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is know when to walk away. Thank you for teaching me about courage. Your friend, George." Marcus stared at the note for several minutes, overwhelmed by the realization that an 8-year-old boy was worried about his safety and was trying, in his own way, to protect him. The role reversal was complete. The guard had become the guarded, and the child had become the protector. As he folded the note and placed it in his wallet, Marcus Thompson made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He would attend the meeting with Pemberton, would learn what he could about the conspiracy, and would find a way to expose it without putting Prince George at further risk. And if that meant sacrificing his own career, his own safety, or even his own life, then so be it. After all, he had learned from the best teacher of all, a brave 8-year-old boy who had shown him that true courage wasn't about following orders or maintaining protocol. It was about doing whatever it took to protect the people you cared about, even when the cost was higher than you had ever imagined paying. The meeting with Pemberton would reveal the full scope of a plot that reached far higher into the establishment than either Marcus or Prince George had suspected. But it would also provide the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy and protect the royal family. In the end, Marcus's resignation would come not from failure or dishonor, but from a quiet heroism that would never be publicly acknowledged but would always be remembered by a young prince who learned that sometimes the most powerful decisions are made not in palaces or parliaments, but in rose gardens where trust is shared between unlikely friends.